Please help me welcome Sally Thompson.
This is the nicest introduction I've ever had. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here in Livingston at this kind of famous bookstore. People all over the state love Elk River books, so I appreciate you all having me here. And we've had quite a week, right? So, left Missoula yesterday morning, feeling a little gray, and then spoke in Bozeman last night, and there was a lot of people were wearing black. Today, I stayed with friends last night here, and then today had an incredible day in the park. It was beautiful, unusually warm, clear skies today, with dear friends from Paradise Valley, and so it's good, really good to be here and kind of settled into, life goes on, and whatever one's perspectives. I hope these stories kind of help us start mending some of the relationships, because we're just so at odds, right? So polarized. And one thing, obviously I was not pleased with the outcome, but my husband yesterday said, well, now we're in the minority. And it was really so interesting for me, this shift in my own perspective of kind of feeling really sorry for myself to thinking, wow, the people I work with and write about have been in the minority for 150 plus years and have learned to be strong, be resilient, hold on to what matters. So that it really helped shift for me, to take that on a little bit. So if that helps anybody, I thank John for those words. I'm going to start just real quick overview of my own background, so why I'm here and how I came to write these stories. So grew up in Colorado, ended up doing work in New Mexico, and then came here and hang out. I'm a little scattered. Let me get myself organized. Actually moved to Bozeman in 1979, so 1 year before moving to Missoula. And I had a 1-year-old, and my husband was doing field work, 10 days on, long drive back from eastern Montana, and 2 days at home. And I got this little 1-year-old whose life was like this because of the coming and going of a parent. And I was trying to finish my dissertation. So it was a difficult year. But my dissertation was on climate change, but not the way we think of it, and it never occurred to me that we would be living in what we're living in that way. It was on looking back at the Holocene, so the world since the ice ages ended. How did people adapt when there was large-scale climate change? And that was based on trying to create a predictive model based on the way hunter-gatherer people live today, or in the last, since people recorded, since ethnographers worked with them. And so interestingly, I was in Colorado, and so looking at the way people moved out of the plains and into the fringe. So all of a sudden that area around Boulder, 6,000 years ago, when there was a major episode of hot, dry, used to call it the altithermal. I'm sure many of you learned about that in school. Anyway, people moved into the fringes, and we're experiencing that today, right? People moving into the mountain fringes, and in some cases for similar reasons, but I never dreamed that we would be seeing that. So then moved to Missoula in 1980, and then a couple of years later found myself digging an archaeological site 5 miles out of Great Falls on the Sun River. It's called the Sun River Site. A crazy way of finding it, and that the Corps of Engineers was going to do some major disturbance, and it was really deep soil, so they said, you've got to do more than surface survey or little shallow pits. So we had a backhoe in there. They dug 12 trenches in this huge area to see, is there anything, and they're going down 10 feet, 12 feet, really deep trenches, however deep a backhoe can go. Robert, how deep is that?
What you said.
Yeah, I thought so. Okay, and so we didn't really see anything. The backhoe operator finally says, you know, what should we do? And I think, oh, geez, okay, let's just do one more. Lucky 13. And then I'm thinking about dinner. You know, what am I going to fix for dinner? And he goes, is this what you're looking for? I look over, and he has just hit this pretty amazing, rich soil change and charcoal and bone, and you know, no doubt we hit an archaeological site. So anyway, that site ended up to be a very important site because it had three components that document this change from extreme drought on back up to the period of, you know, more modern climate. And the bottom drought layer, which is, as I recall, about 6,200 years old, it's all pronghorn and not much of it. I think there might have been one bison bone, but every pronghorn bone there is hammered to nothing. So those people are starving. You know, you're sucking mandibles of these little jaws, and then, you know, through time it kind of gets back to the normal mix of fauna that Lewis and Clark recorded when they were in that same area in 1805 and 6. And it just was, you know, a pretty eye-opening reality that people had to abandon large areas. And my own understanding of this, my interpretation of the archaeology, it was Blackfeet ancestors who had moved from around the southern Saskatchewan area and come into to that mountain fringe where you could count on some spring water and some animals because of the ecotone there, the mix of prairie and mountain, and some, you know, steady water. But times were bleak, I think, you know, really hard to imagine, but we might have to. I switched out of archaeology when a Pend Oreille friend told me she found what I did for a living to be highly offensive. And after processing that whole shocking statement, she said it actually in a kind of a kind, thoughtful way. But she wanted, as if we were going to be friends, I needed to understand how she felt about it. Anyway, so I moved on to saying I would only do archaeology for people whose remains I was investigating. If they wanted it, needed it, could be helped by it, I would do it. And it was kind of a scary thing to do. I had a lot of training to send me on one path, and all of a sudden I'm going to take the risk of finding a different one. And it was like a miracle that really good work came my way. So I got to do water rights work for Taos Pueblo using my archaeological background to serve their needs. And we actually documented 1,000-year-old ditches, first oldest known ditches there, and they got priority claim on the Rio Grande River. So that was great work. And then I worked at, with the Blackfeet on the Badger 2 medicine. Do you guys know the Badger 2 medicine? Raise your hands if you don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, those are two streams in the headwaters of the Missouri, just east of the Blackfeet Reservation and just south of Glacier National Park. Originally part of the Blackfeet Reservation, and kind of they lost it in the 1890s through a treaty process that they misunderstood. Anyway, they still argue about it, and it's really important land for them. Those mountains are, they say that's like our church, and that's where people went for vision quests and to restore their souls. And then it was being threatened with gas and oil development. My work was to assess its importance in terms of the National Register of Historic Places through, at that time, a new process called Traditional Cultural Properties. Anyway, that I learned so much through that process, as I had with Taos Pueblo, because I went from a book-learned grad student, you know, actually a pretty cocky PhD, right? I had my document and was ready to go. And they helped me learn life. It was humbling. I made lots of terrible errors and offensive errors. And with gentle help, it's one thing you will find in Indian country, people are gentle about correcting behavior. They don't shame the way, you know, my life it was surrounded by kind of shaming and guilt to get me to behave properly. And so it was it was a gentle way to help me see what I could be and see instead of you're wrong and you should go to your room. So I'm really grateful for that kind of learning opportunity. Then after and that area is now protected and all the gas and oil leases have been removed. So it's a real celebration. We worked in the early phases of the process and lots of people did a lot of hard work to make that happen. Then I got to work on the Clark Fork River case, Clark Fork, with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. They went in on a lawsuit against the state, or with the state against ARCO for the pollution caused by the mining up the headwaters and the smelting. And they had off-reservation treaty rights, and so it was my work to document the extent of that and what we could learn. So I got to work with tribal elders and with homestead elders. At that time, it was all men who had grown up tagging along with their grandpas who had homesteaded along the Clark Fork tributaries. So especially Flint Creek, there were a lot of intact ranches there with elders who really had listened, and they remembered the Salish would reappear every time about the time the geese came back, and then they'd camp in that area in traditional sites. And I learned so much from both the tribal elders and the tribes were really pleased because the details that they had forgotten were remembered by people who were still on the ground. And that was really instrumental learning for me about how if you're in place, the stories there hold it and you don't forget it. When you pass that place, you remember it, right? And if you've had to move, you lose some of those details. So we got to reweave some of them, and there were connections made between those homestead families and the tribes. And so, anyway, that was a great learning process. And also through one of the conversations with some of those homestead families, I learned that the Salish had traded smoked fish to them. So it helped support the off-reservation claim about their losses on the river, because not only were they fishing, it was an industry for them to be having a trade item. So a lot of good things came out of that. And then finally I got to run a project at the University of Montana for 10 years called the Regional Learning Project. And we collaborated with tribes on, initially on their points of view about the Lewis and Clark story. And we branched out, but originally it was all tribes along those trails. And I got to interview like 250 elders from 30-something tribes. And, you know, they're all people who are gone now, and got, you know, incredible learning that way as well. So all of that then shaped the way I see reality, right? Quite different, I think, certainly from my book learning. And the one thing I just want to back up to Taos for a minute, because I learned something there that really shifted my view, and a lot of that comes through in this book. In grad school, at that time, I learned not to trust oral history. Like, you know, why would you know, people just make up stuff and they change it in the retelling in the way we do, right? Something happened, and, you know, it's well documented. We don't hold those stories intact. So I'm at Taos, and I asked, one of the first things I asked of the Water Task Force elders was, do you have a story about your first ditch? And so through translation, the youngest of these old men told me, as the other one was telling him in Tiwa, the story. And it was a ditch that was up at the north end of the Pueblo called Dancing Eagle Tail Feathers Ditch. Dancing Eagle Tail Feathers, and they would show you like this. And I probably was rolling my eyes. This quaint story about a ditch long ago and dancing eagle tail feathers. Well, then we were doing remote sensing work, looking at aerial photographs and analyzing the patterns and looking for patterns that didn't fit the normal flow of water that might indicate movement of water through irrigation. And I'll be darned, there was all sorts of it. And the best data was up at the north end of the Pueblo, and right where they said it was. And in doing the investigation of the archaeological remains up there, it was a 1,000-year-old ditch system with pit houses and reservoirs and fields. And so I thought, "Oh, that was a really ridiculous way to respond to them, So like I was so important as a 28-year-old or whatever I was, and these elders are telling me a really old story because they dated back to 1,000 years. So then one of the men on the task force we were driving around on the Pueblo lands, and he was telling me his clan's migration story. And I said, Ray, it sounds like you're taking me back to the Pleistocene. And again, I'm thinking in my mind, oh yeah, come on. And he's thoughtful, and he says, well, I think I am. And, yeah, right. And then I said, well, I don't know how you could keep a story intact for 12,000 years, this just makes no sense to me. And he said, we repeat that story once a year in the kiva in a ceremony. It's kind of like your silent night. You wouldn't change the words. So all of a sudden, this concept of oral history being trustworthy because they didn't change the words, just like we wouldn't make up a different version of Silent Night, right? So I started listening differently. I think before that, I had always just closed my mind and thought these are quaint stories and you can't trust them as a source of history. But I really started listening differently. So you'll find that theme a kind of major one in the book, just woven through the different stories I encountered through time. I don't know if that's my own phone. Last night my husband's phone went off while I was speaking. Nope, somebody else is dinging over there. I'm good. Okay, so I'm going to just read from the introduction a little bit about then how I came to write this book. So for just quick background, a friend of mine said, why don't you write those stories you're always telling? I could probably do that, okay. And I was midstream with another book that I had been working on for an eon. I just want to say, my preview copy came last week. It comes out next month. Black Robes Enter Coyote's World. Chief Charlot and Father just met in the Rocky Mountains. So if you're interested in this subject, it will be available starting December 1st. It's a really cool cover. I'm so pleased with it. So I was kind of waiting for Nebraska Press to tell me if they were going to take the book and twiddling my thumbs. And so anyways, like, yeah, I could probably crank out those stories because I know them well and tell them a lot. So that's the background, and then I'm going to tell you how I then went about which stories will I tell and how will I go about this. So, having decided to write this book, my first task was to figure out which tales to tell. I began the cumbersome task of excavating through my ample files and field journals, looking for compelling stories. Like finely flaked projectile points found during a dig, topics revealed by my mental trowel sorted themselves into folders. Content came from both written and oral histories and from my own experiences. The process stirred up old memories, many of them unrelated to the focus of the work. For instance, from a long ago summer spent surveying on the Tongue River, I remembered seeing 3 colors of rattlesnake: green like the prickly pear, red like the sandstone, and beige like the sere soil. In my mind's eye, the colors are still vivid, as are the ridgetops and bottomlands where I walked. Near Townsend one June, I was delighted by an unexpected field of blooming bitterroots along an old Salish trail to the Musselshell River. These ancillary experiences returned me to the places where they happened. These kinds of experiences, like the first time one sees fireflies or witnesses a large owl glide silently past, are the ones that carry the memories forward. I believe we remember these times because of the emotional responses that take us beyond data collecting. We all have had such moments. Montana's varied and magnificent character provides a wealth of opportunity for such memories to form, and always has. Sharing our stories about her is part of what it means to belong here. So I go on and tell about the different piles and how they got organized, and generally I organized it in 5 geographical areas. The first one, though, is stories that transect the whole state, the first area, and then The second is Northwest Montana, because I worked quite a bit with the Kootenays and in Kootenai country. And one is Kootenai Oral History and Glacial Lake Geology, and how those two stories are two peas in a pod. So again, in the past I would have thought this oral tradition about their origins was quaint. And boy, you think of it with an open mind and you realize they're telling post-glacial history of the emptying of those glacial lakes with a water monster that's going round and round. So see what you think. It's just my interpretation, no proof, but it holds up pretty well. And a story of Father Desmet in that territory, a really kind of odd story. Again, like Mark said, not one you will have read. All of these stories are based in my own experience of Montana history, so maybe that's why they're unexpected. It's in my sort of quirky mind of what I find interesting. The third part's the Buffalo Commons, so this area is part of that. And one really amazing thing was I found some previously unpublished and unknown illustrated journals that tell the story of going to the Lame Bull Treaty Council in 1855 that was up at the mouth of the Judith River, and even explains why it was at the Judith when it was supposed to be at Fort Benton. And there are pictures from this guy's journals. His name's Thomas Adams. Some of the pictures are in here and others in this book because they're like some pretty amazing things that no one had seen before. Portraits of people that are well known, but nobody had ever seen an image of them. And so the Salish community is pretty excited about this. And you think there's nothing left to find. Everybody's done the research and then, wow, this was amazing. Another one that's one of my favorites in the book from that Buffalo Commons is Abraham Maslow's Surprising Summer at Siksika. So how many of you know that Abraham Maslow's, do you know the theory of the hierarchy of needs? He developed that theory after spending a summer with his Siksika, the northmost Blackfoot Confederacy tribe. And a pretty unknown story, except within the tribal community, and really fascinating. So that one's quite meaningful. And Disturbing the Sleeping Buffalo. How many of you have seen the buffalo that I'm referring to here? Up on the High Line, there's a sleeping buffalo hot spring, and out at the turnoff, there's this giant glacial erratic boulder that looks like a sleeping buffalo. So it's a fun story about how the hucksters of Malta had the stone moved from the ridge where it belonged to bring it as a tourist attraction in town, and they put it in the town square, and with another one called Medicine Rock, and those stones started bellowing. Now, I didn't believe this story when it was told to me, and then I found evidence in the local newspapers that the police would be called out because this noise from the park was keeping people awake. Some people said that the stones even turned themselves toward home. The people moved these stones out of town. So whatever was going on, people were really bothered by them. And this was not easy. We're talking tons and tons, right? So they had to get somebody from Helena with some special truck to move them out of their world. Anyway, pretty interesting story, and then with the tribal accounts about it as well. And then a few other stories there, and then Clark Fork Basin, because of the work I've done on the Clark Fork and that I live there. Fair number of the stories, but they're all applicable. They're Montana history stories, and it doesn't really matter which town. Often the threads are similar. And then the Rocky Mountain Front. So the work on the Badger to Medicine and along the Old North Trail. And I'm going to, if there's time, I'll read briefly from one of them about Lewis and Clark Pass and a research project I was on. And so those are the areas. And just to demonstrate how quirky or different these are, the first section where the stories all transect the state or the area. The first part's a couple of Lewis and Clark related stories because that's where Montana history begins, right? In almost anything you read. You know, there may be a little paragraph about there were Indians here, but Lewis and Clark is where we begin the story. So I really enjoyed some things I had learned through research that, have you ever heard of Moncotchtape? So, what if Thomas Jefferson's scientific speculation about a northwest route to the Pacific was based on the account of someone who had already made the trip? Imagine how much less risky the cross-country expedition of Lewis and Clark might have been had some predecessor traveled along those Indian trails up the Missouri, across the Continental Divide, and down the Columbia, and lived to tell about it. The famous explorer's situation would have been that much better if they'd had a map to follow and knew about how long the trip might take. Well, in fact, they did. I'm just going to leave you to that one. And then Lewis and Clark, came up the Missouri and went through the entirety of eastern Montana, down to where they entered Idaho, without seeing a single soul. Do you think there weren't people there? Do you think they were watched? Well, I could find two stories that really document that, and one of them is the Assiniboine, the most powerful story and really intact in their oral tradition about observing these strangers. I mean, these were not, people in eastern Montana weren't canoe people. Western Montana, you start finding canoes and Columbia River people, but the Missouri, so you see a bunch of people bringing boats, hauling boats up the river, was really unusual. And then there are white people. Now the Assiniboine had seen white people. There's a lot of trade going on from Canada. But this was unusual. This was almost like an invasion of their territory. So the scouts went and told the chief and the elders, what's going on, and they had a big meeting, and through discussion they came to the consensus that they would not interfere with these people as long as they didn't get off the river corridor or show any signs of aggression. So scouts should follow them all the way till they got to Snake Butte area, which is north of the river, but that's where it's on Fort Bell now. And you read the journals and you realize they're seeing the smoke that's in, one from the village originally, and then the smoke signals that they had been told to set out when the party left their territory. And Clark writes that he saw smoke from up north, and so this story all went on in the background, and during the Lewis and Clark bicentennial, this came forward from the Assiniboine community, and down to people's memories of who was involved and how the decisions were made. And then finally in this early section, because we know the way we tell our Lewis and Clark history and fur trade history. So for fur trade era, but early, have any of you heard of John Coulter? Okay, so now we have a lot of people, we know John Coulter, really brave dude. He escaped from the Blackfeet and ran in miles barefoot, and then hid in a log jam or a beaver dam until they were gone, and then he had to walk 200 miles to find somebody to help him. Well, you might never, I'm going to read just the brief introduction here, you might never have heard of Marie Dorian, born in St. Louis in 1786, the daughter of an Iowa mother and a French father. No portrait of her exists. Her remarkable life, like that of countless other courageous Indian women, has not been the focus of biographers except for her role in the death-defying expedition sent west by John Jacob Astor in 1811. Marie's greatest challenge actually came 2 years later. Although she may never have stepped foot in what would become Montana, her amazing story deserves to be remembered by those of us who occupy what was then known as the Oregon country. She puts Coulter's story to, looks like, kid stuff. This woman with 2 children survived a series of circumstances and an entire winter camped out by a spring near, in the Wallowa Valley of eastern Oregon. eking out an existence out of nothing and managed to survive and keep her kids alive. And it turns out her grandson was buried in the Missoula cemetery. So it ended up having a connection to Montana, so I could put it in the book. Anyway, that gives you a sense of, I'm looking from it through a different lens, trying to understand the Native point of view, wherever people were who lived there, and what did they think of this story. And women, they were part of the story too, but often we don't read that. So, how are we doing for time? Maybe we just want to talk, or I could read a little bit more from a story, or
7:40.
we're 7:42. I think we're good. So why don't we just go to Q&A and comments, thoughts?
Good question.
Tom?
Did you find it hard to get Indian people to talk to you?
Not at this time, but that's because I have a long-standing relationship with lots of people. But through time, yeah, initially, you have to take time to get to know each other before they're going to tell you anything. And then they need to trust your intentions. And then relationships
I don't know what you're talking about with the excavation with your Pangaray friend suggests. I mean, they can often be mistrustful. Are you going to exploit this somehow? You're going to make money on the book and so on.
Oh, well, that's what's been so heartening, that because I have learned a lot. So the stories don't offend people. They're happy to have them down and have to step forward to offer to put, share blurbs to support it. The spiritual leader of the Salish has his blurb on the front of the cover, of which he wanted to do as a way to say this is good, it should be read. But it was 40 years of learning to get me to that place, and I certainly worked with them all along the way, and had them review this Bitterroot Salish elder key group all reviewed
You
it.
gave your interviewees a chance to read what you'd written.
Oh, always. I would never just take something. Yeah. The people before the Park Books co-authored with those two groups, with the Kootenai Culture Committee and the Piikani Traditional Association. And it took 7 years, because imagine writing a book with two Indian communities, who have very different points of view of reality. But again, just what an incredible opportunity to work through telling seasonal rounds in and around Glacier Park with their guidance, and they had final word on it completely. That's the only way that this works, right? There's the days of anthropologists writing Indians books is over, in that old way. Robert.
So you were mentioning that your Ponderay friend was offended by your archaeology, offended by excavating human remains? Is that what she was offended by?
Well, certainly that, which I had not done. But no, what was interesting, it was Archaeology Week, Montana Archaeology Week, and I'd been asked to give a talk in Stevensville about the prehistory in the Bitterroot Valley. And she had been asked to give a talk on Salish history in the Bitterroot Valley. And we rode together, and she was the only one in the car that knew we were going to talk about the same thing. Because she knew that prehistory was also their history, and that pre just meant that this was before Lewis and Clark, right? So it was like, oh duh, I missed that one. But after we spoke, then a friend came up and showed me this beautiful flaked knife that she found in her garden in Florence. And so that's what got my Salish friend, Ponderay friend, worked up a little bit, because she said on the way home, I have something hard to say to you. I find what you do for a living to be highly offensive. And she said, your friend bringing that knife, you don't know that somebody didn't put that knife there for a purpose, and that it's still holding something. and should have been left there. You know, archaeologists think it's all trash. It isn't necessarily trash. There's a spiritual relationship with many things that are left behind. And to disturb them is not your business. It's like, whoa, she's harsh. I mean, there's no doubt about it. She's a woman who speaks like that. And, you know, I had no choice but to listen because I'm driving. And let it sink in. And I just thought, I don't know enough to know that I want to do that. So
do any of your native acquaintances find any value in archaeological research?
Sure. But under circumstances that they understand and have input on. And there would be times where, well, the Kootenai Culture Committee for years just said, we're not doing anything with archaeologists. We'd rather our remains run into the rivers than be stuck in shelves in an archaeologist's lab. One of the stories in here is about returning a child burial back to the Confederated Tribes. I was responsible for the NAGPRA process for the University of Montana, which is Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And the university, the physical anthropologist didn't want to let go of this child's skeleton because it was fairly intact. And they argued that it wasn't an Indian. So I had to work really hard to dig into Missoula's history to figure out because this child was found just right near St. Patrick's Hospital in 1950. And anyway, that story's here, but it's, I again learned so much about their attitudes about death and bones and all of that, and they appreciated having them return, but it was so painful. It was painful to work on it. The first several meetings were just sitting with their pain because it was like another, it was bad enough how this child, you know, what her life became during this transition period when Missoula was becoming a white town. And then that archaeologists would dig it up, and then instead of reburying it after, it was encountered not by archaeologists, but it was handed over to archaeologists. And then it didn't get reburied. It's just been this child had been in a drawer for 70 years, and they, that just breaks their hearts. And so to have to sit there and now let's talk about it, and they don't want to have to do that either, right? So every stage is painful, and so you just have to witness that is their reality, whether it's yours or not, in your belief about bones and spirits.
Yeah, I can empathize with that and understand that with human remains. But what about things you learn in prehistory about their lifeways? Are Native people interested in learning about what their ancestors did?
I'll tell you a story that is, it is a response to this from a Taos man, because I couldn't answer that in a global way by any means, but he told me one day when I was working down there that he and his brother had been on this one little back road, and they'd seen two Oya rims coming out of the side of a road. So, big jars, big clay jars. And so that they could see that they were buried there. And so I'm like, oh, what'd you do? I'm of course thinking they stopped and dug them up or something. And he said, oh, we reburied, we covered them up carefully. And I said, wouldn't you want to know what was in there and all that? And he said, we're not really curious about that. We know who we are. You archaeologists are curious. You want to find out about our past, but what matters to us is us. And we know who we've been, and no, they don't have that. And I've been told that by the governor of the Pueblo a couple of years later, said something really similar about, and then I asked about, at that time, Taos wasn't trying to save their language. And I said, why aren't you doing that? And one of them said, if there's nobody who understands anymore the world that language was spoken in, what would it matter? I'm like, well, for the good of, not to lose the knowledge that's in there, but that knowledge related to a world that apparently wouldn't exist anymore. So Why would you why would you care? Anyway, so it was quite different. It was like, no, we know who we are. And I think when you've never left your place, you do know who you are, and you don't need to be curious about it. You know, I wrote a kind of tongue-in-cheek thing after working at Taos that was digging for roots in other people's gardens. But that's what archaeology had been for me. So,
That's interesting.
yeah. Anything else? All right then. Yeah.
I believe you went to the University of Colorado.
Oh,
So did I. Were you acquainted with Patty Limerick?
she came after.
Oh,
I'm
she
very
did.
old,
Okay.
but she's sure brought a lot of insight into
Right.
a whole
Yeah.
different way of telling
Yeah,
history.
I really love her approach to history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Did you have something?
I was just wondering what you're interested in right now. What are you into?
Recovery. You know, it's been like 10 solid years of working on these 2 books, and yeah, I actually am really kind of tired of linear thinking and writing, and really want to do something more circular. I don't know, something more artistic or just nothing. You know, like what would real retirement feel like? I don't know. So I'd like to explore that. My husband would like us to travel a little bit and just not be committed to this work. But as things are important, I do like to continue to share them. Try to, as I said at the beginning, you know, there's so much polarity in our relationships now, and I hope that with more understanding of each other that we do a better job for the next generations. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.